So this video is going to look at the ethical interview technique. Now, interviewing an offender or someone charged with a crime before being sentenced has to be done ethically, as do all interviews. And this can be challenging as the crime in question might be shocking and an interviewer is not going to be immune to such issues. It's the interviewer in charge of the interview who is responsible for working ethically. Now, conducting an ethical interview is more likely to get valid information than if the interviewer brings in their own views and judgments into the interviewing process. There has to be due process. Now, this means that the criminal justice system tends to have the power in a situation, such as where someone is being interviewed before possibly being charged, and yet the individual has the rights which have to be adhered to. Now, some ethical standards for interviewing relating to crime are listed on the screen here. So every human being has worth and has to be treated with dignity, and this can relate to self-determination, part of the principles in the BPS Code of Ethics and Conduct. Now, an interview must be carried out in a non-judgmental way with openness and treat interviewees in a fair way. Now, interviewers must not affect the interview or the data gathered, and in this regard, the interviews must not involve coercion and material gains from an interview must not be suppressed. Interviewers should use different ways of gathering information so that reliability and validity can be checked as far as possible. There should be no shortcuts in an interview. The truth must be the focus and not a confession, and anyone with special needs or any sort must be treated with additional care when interviewing, taking into account their needs. Interviewers should not bring in false information or use deception to get a confession, as this can be deceiving someone and is therefore not ethical. Now, issues can include peace. So peace ethical interviews should all follow peace. So the P is for planning and preparation. So the planning phase is about the importance of planning the interview before carrying it out, such as noting aims and objectives as well as the required outcomes. Topics of interest are noted and questions can be designed. The place and time of the interview must also be planned for as well, and how well it can be recorded. The second is engage and explain. Now, this is the need to build rapport with the suspect, which can mean explaining how the interview will take place and how to answer the questions to allay concerns. Now, witnesses are told what to expect, basically. The third one is account. Now, this account is the invitation to a suspect to provide an account of their behaviour depending on what's being investigated. The way the account will be asked for and how it will be elicited from a witness is decided upon. Now, the ethical interview includes ideas about different ways of doing this. Stage 4 is closure. Now, closure is about bringing an interview to a good conclusion, basically, ensuring that the rapport has been maintained. So the aim is to avoid anger or anxiety as the interview closes. And then the last stage, the fifth stage, is evaluate. So interviewers should be evaluated against the required aims to look at the material obtained. Peace can be a really helpful way of remembering the process that an ethical interview has to follow, because peace is the structure that's meant to build trust, and the idea of engaging and explain is that the person feels their needs are being listened to and taken into account during the planning the interview stage. It was actually Shepard who used the term ethical interviewing to explain the interviewing and how this interview should treat suspects with respect and as equals and with the same rights to dignity, self-determination and choice. Now, Baldwin puts forward the idea of rapport, and this rapport-based interviewing using a non-accusational approach, and Peace was the UK's first effort at ethical interviewing to make sure that this was happening. Now, the focus on rapport is important because this rapport leads to trust, which reduces anxiety and distress in a witness or a suspect, meaning more information is likely to be disclosed in an interview and therefore effectively retrieved from memory. It also means that the information gathered will be more reliable. Now, the evidence is from Fisher and Gilesman, who talk about using a cognitive interview, whereas using ethical interviews and cognitive interviews are very similar in many aspects, including this drive to uncover as much correct information as possible. However, the ethical interview emphasises using rapport to reduce stress and anxiety for moral and ethical reasons, and as much as for producing the correct information. Now, Fisher and Gilesman also emphasise ethics when they suggest the rapport, and suggesting that this idea of rapport means showing empathy and active listening, paying attention to the needs of the witness and the suspects, and this not only improves the interview with regard to the information yielded, but also the ethical guidelines. Now, in the peace model, closure is about getting any final information, so considering the efficiency of the interview. But it's not about making sure that the witness or the suspect is, happy that the interview is finished. It's about making sure that they're not being left in any sort of distress or anxiety by the interview. So there are lots of different approaches that can be used within the ethical interviewing. So the account part of the peace model is where the suspect or the witness tells the story that the interviewer wants to uncover. And there are lots of different strategies that can be used within this account section in order to help with the conversation management. Now, conversation management focuses on what is known from the memory research, and there are 3 phases within this. So the suspect agenda, the police agenda, and then the challenge. And these ideas come from Shepherd. Now, the suspect agenda starts with open questions about the offence, and the suspect can say anything about it. The interviewer lets the suspect speak in their own words without interruption, and the interview will focus on the suspect's agenda. The police agenda is to clarify the account, not to challenge it. Now, issues the suspect did not cover but may be of police interest can be explored, and this is about getting some of the finer details. Now, Robert gives an example of this. For example, a suspect saying they were driving a yellow car, and then in the interview stage they might have asked for more details such as the registration, which is part of the police agenda. Now, the challenge phase is where the interviewer would explore any inaccuracies that may have come up in the other stages of the research. So, for example, the reason for leaving challenge to the end is to avoid the confusion of the questions, such as confabulating the memories. Now, it's important that that challenge stage be done really calmly, in a controlled manner, which avoids anger and therefore threats within the interview. So some studies that have looked at the effectiveness of ethical interview, the most prominent one kind of comes from Roberts within 2011. Now, Roberts looked at police interviews with terrorist suspects, focusing on risks for the ethical interviewing and justice. Now, the focus was on the social context within which the interviews with terrorist suspects would take place, and how the context may affect the interview and that would be carried out by police officers. Now, the idea was that there would be a robust, even aggressive tactics, and the risks included getting unreliable information, as well as the risk of such interviewing impacting the community and impacting the police community cooperation. Now, a way of improving this interview then is to therefore improve the cultural awareness of the police officers, and another way is to improve how the interviewing itself is actually done. So the use of ethical interviews was suggested, including focusing on the planning and preparation, the engaging and the explain, the account, the closure and the evaluation of the interview, and the managing of the conversation. And Roberts suggested that using ethical interview may actually improve the reliability of the interviewee information, as well as affects how the communities will view the police. And this study gives information in favour of the ethical interview. In terms of evaluation, there's lots of evidence that ethical interviewing is more effective than standard interviewing. So Kebbel et al. In 2010 found some interviewing techniques were better than others, and this included ethical interviewing in terms of the effective category. Roberts, again in 2011, suggested that using ethical interview may improve the reliability of the information, as well as affect how the communities view the police. Ethical interviewing can be good regarding a moral concern, such as building relationships, and acknowledging that harm should not be done and that there should be self-determination. It's also good in terms of getting reliable and detailed information. Although it can be hard to separate the effectiveness of ethical interviewing using the peace model from moral and ethical successes in using such interviews, a strength is that there is little need to separate the two aspects of interviewing from ethical interviewing, because it does seem to get more detail and more reliable information. What I'm saying here is that it isn't necessary to look at cognitive and ethical interview as two separate things, because ethical interviews isn't just about being nice to people and therefore sacrificing the information. The evidence suggests that actually approaching the interview in an ethical way does actually enhance the quality of the information given, as well as making sure that people are treated with dignity and respect. Fisher and Geisman emphasise this point as well, so they suggest that this rapport element of the cognitive interview is about showing that empathy and active listening, including the paying attention to the needs of the witness and the suspect, and they support this idea that doing that and adhering to these ethical guidelines will allow and improve the information gained within the interview. Weaknesses, though, is that even though it's said to be chosen by the British police, it isn't used in all situations. Now, Walsh and Milne in 2010 showed that even interviewers who were trained in ethical interviewing weren't actually that good at it, particularly the building rapport required. And it seems that in the 99 audio tapes of these interviews of benefit fraud suspects, even though the ethical interviewing using the peace model is the required standard within the UK, it might not be used fully. And if it's not used properly or used effectively in terms of all its stages, then it limits the effectiveness in regard of what's being uncovered, but also with regards to the ethics in the interview situation. Now, in studies that look at ethical interviewing, there's often focus on what is being recalled, including the detail and whether it's correct. And this is similar to the cognitive interview, that, for example, building a rapport is said to help the witness relax and therefore aid recall. But studies looking at the ethical implications alone of ethical interviewing seem to be much more difficult to track down.